people with disabilities don't have special needs. They have human needs. They need the same thing we all need. They need food, water, comfort, housing, belonging, acceptance, independence, all of these things. The means by which they might access those things they might need accommodations, they might need different supports, they might need different avenues, but at the end of the day, they want and need the same things.
Welcome to the Riverside Project podcast. We are mobilizing Houston to empower families and transform generations. We hope these conversations will give you a greater understanding of the issues facing our community and inspire you to find your place along the river.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Riverside Project podcast. My name is Chandler James, and today we have a good friend of mine who I've actually known since high school, Kayla Williams, on the podcast. And so Kayla is a former foster, now adoptive mom and early childhood special education teacher in Bryan, Texas. Kayla was a foster parent for 2 years before adopting her daughter Gracie in 2022. As a single parent raising a disabled child, Kayla brings a unique perspective to the foster care community and is very passionate about how the system can better support children with disabilities who have also experienced trauma. Kayla, thanks for being on the podcast.
Of course, happy to be
here. I feel like we haven't seen each other in forever,
I know.
I'm excited that you're here and having a conversation. So thanks for making the drive all the way from Bryan. Tell, for our audience and those who are listening, tell us a little bit about you, who you are, your family, kind of what you do, things like that.
Yeah, so I guess picking up where we saw each other last, almost 15 years ago. I went to Texas A&M for college to study education, became a teacher. I was a regular pre-K teacher. That didn't last long before I made the switch and hopped over to special education, and then became a foster parent about 2019, 2020. And then through that process, then was connected with my daughter, who I fostered and then adopted. And then now we're just sort of journeying life together, just the two of us.
I feel like since I've known you, you've always, which is really cool to see where you're at now, to be honest. Even just following on social media. I know we don't chat all the time or anything like that, but like seeing you, like I always wanted to be a teacher and I always want to do it. And like you're doing it. Mm-hmm. In terms of the foster care space, like what has that journey really looked like for you? Where did that come from? What is that? Yeah, just tell me a little bit about that journey.
What's funny about that is I don't feel like, where we grew up, I don't remember being around foster families, adoptive families. I don't remember that ever being in the atmosphere. I went to college and then kind of suddenly it was, and I'm not sure I was even super conscious of it at first. I nannied for a family that had adopted several kids from foster care. And then just had families in my church and people around me who had connections to foster care, to adoption, things like that. And then I sort of slowly kind of came to this point where I felt like God was telling me that at some point I was going to be a foster parent. But there's sort of the traditional timeline of things. You go to college and graduate college, and then you get married, and then you maybe have a couple biological kids, and then you become a foster parent. And then, that's sort of the way it goes. And I sort of had a realization probably early 2019 maybe, where I just really heard God say to me, you don't need to be waiting on these boxes to be checked to become a foster parent. The only thing you're waiting on is for me to tell you when it's time. And so I sort of just kind of had open hands with that. And then at a point felt God telling me, okay, it's time, which of course is really scary to be. I think I was 23, 24 maybe, single of course, and relatively early in my teaching career, and just felt like God was saying it was time. And so I decided I'm just going to move forward until it stops feeling peaceful. I don't know if, I'm sure other people can relate, but you hear God tell you something, but then sometimes you still are just like, but are you sure though? Like, is that really what God said, or is that me? And so I just sort of said, I'm just going to move forward. And then if God tells me to stop, I'll stop this process, because as you know, it is a long process to get from making a decision to be a foster parent to actually licensed and open and ready for placement. And so started to move through that process and got licensed. There was kind of a weird time between getting licensed and getting my first placement. Just some things in my county with the way placements were working systems weren't working the right way. And so there was kind of a waiting period, which ended up being great because it was just several months of here I am and I'm ready and the phone is not ringing, which is a good thing because it
Right.
means kids are not coming into care.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I knew they were and they
Sure.
were just going elsewhere. So I just spent a lot of that time leaning into learning. One thing that I prayed all throughout that time, because I knew I thought it might be one of the hardest parts of foster care, is for God to give me a really soft heart towards the kids who would come to my care, towards their parents, towards their moms specifically, just as a mom. And I mean, God incredibly blessed me in that I felt like when I did have kids come into my care, that wasn't one of the big things I really struggled with, was the frustration. I felt like I really could take their moms at just who they are in this moment, not the things they'd done that led up to these things, but just who are they today, right now, a mom who's separated from their child, and then what are our next steps? What are we going to do? How are we going to move forward and hopefully maybe see these kids come back together with their parents? So it was really just listening to God throughout the process. And then even, to go into my story, a little bit of how my daughter and I came together. I fostered a couple kiddos, mostly younger babies and toddlers. And then I had a little baby leave to go be placed in the same placement as his brother. And there was a lot of things about the way that situation went down that I disagreed with, and I really fought against it. And as I put him in the car, I said to the caseworker, I'm keeping my beds open because I know this isn't going to work. So call me and I'll take them both. Bring me the brothers. And I'd already offered to take the brother.
Yeah.
They decided to move the baby because it'd be easier to move the baby than the 3-year-old. And I said, call me when it doesn't work and I'll take them back, and I'm keeping my home open for them.
Yeah.
And then about 2 weeks later, I got a text from my caseworker that said, hey, this other worker who I knew from my initial training has reached out. She's got a 3-year-old that she needs to place that has, multiple disabilities and is medically complex. And she had a stroke, and she's functioning about like a 9-month-old. And she wanted to know if you're interested. And my caseworker had already said, I already told her probably not. It's probably too much. This kid probably needs to go into primary medical needs home. And I just kind of responded back like, I have questions. It's not a no. I have questions. And then that started a process of asking questions and going back and forth and getting relicensed for primary medical needs and becoming a therapeutic home and all of that. And then she came to me, and she's been with me for 4 years. So I feel like my journey from there to being her mom has never been one where I just set out to say, this is what I'm going to do. It was more of just God putting things in front of me and just, the next yes, doing the next thing, and then finding myself here.
Yeah. Talk to me. I have a lot of questions. What kind, like you said, when the caseworker called, child with disabilities, like this, that, and the other, here's the situation. And she even almost like pre-decided for you a little bit of like, this is probably a no. And then you say, I have questions.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on in your mind? And like, I'm curious, like for those who may be listening that don't know a lot about kids with disabilities, they don't know a lot about medically complex children, etc. What kind of questions are going through your head? And what are you asking?
It was a lot of practical questions. It was, does she have a feeding tube or does she eat by mouth? Does she have medical equipment? Is she on oxygen, a trach? Because I had a few things that felt like too much. For one, a trach. That felt like too much. A feeding tube felt doable, but I was going to definitely have big questions about that. She had neither of those, so that was okay. My other big question was going to be what services are in place. In the United States, special education services start at 3 years old. The day a child turns 3, they're eligible for public school special education services. I'm a teacher, so I knew I need childcare, and I also know how hard it is for disabled children and medically complex children to find a spot in a daycare that will take them. So that was another big question. As I work full-time as a single parent, I can't take a child without knowing I'm going to have a way to figure out childcare. And I've got my parents, but they don't live in town. They live an hour away. So this is not a situation of, grandma can keep the kiddo for a couple months till we sort it out. So that was one of my big questions is she already enrolled in school? Because the other thing about public school, and again, I only know this because of what I do for a living, is IEPs, special education services, those transfer. So if she's getting services wherever she lives right now, I can enroll her tomorrow in my district and she'll get services that day. There's no wait. If she's not receiving services, that's a months-long process.
I see.
So that was a big question. She was already in school. That was fantastic.
Did this worker know your background?
Yes, that's why she reached out. There was 2 workers who did my FAD, my original, whatever they call it, training. And they were both FAD workers in my county. And then she had transitioned out of that role and then became, I don't know if she was in the adoptions unit or if she was a conservatorship worker. But she was then my daughter's caseworker. So when she needed to place her, she reached out to my FAD worker because she knew my background and said, hey, we've got this kiddo. And they were pretty desperate for placement. They knew she would need an adoptive placement because rights had already been terminated. The case was already over. But when they asked me to take her, it was she's going to need forever, but right now we're just asking for right now. We're not asking for forever right now. We're asking for today because the kinship home she was in gave a date that said she has to be out by this day. So we need her moved by this day. And she moved on that day. So, I knew that there was not going to be able to be a long timeline of, setting up school and services and things. It needed to be, if I was going to be able to take her, I was going to need to be able to take her and enroll her in school and, find daycare for the other half of the day because it was half day school at 3. And, I asked a lot of questions too about medications. Is she on any medications? What are the specific diagnoses? I didn't get answers to most of that. Most of those things, I was given a little information about how much vision she had. That ended up not being accurate at all. Was given information about clothing and diaper sizes. Again, that was not accurate either. A lot of times caseworkers are just operating off of what little they have, and then they're just doing their best to be the intermediary because I was asking questions to her and then she's turning around and asking questions to the kinship parent and, trying to sort of funnel the information. And I just sort of had to accept, as long as I know the really, really big things, then everything else I can figure out. And thankfully, because I was connected with, she came with no equipment. She needed a wheelchair. She needed a walker. She wasn't walking. And I had a wheelchair dropped off at my house before she even enrolled in school by our school physical therapist because I picked up the phone and said,
you knew who to call.
I knew exactly who to call. And that took a huge weight. I just think about parents who take in kids like her but don't have the experience. And my mind was spinning enough. And like you said, I knew who to call. I knew where to go. I knew what the steps were going to be. And it was still, it was still overwhelming.
It's funny hearing, because we legit, for people listening, I know we already said it, but it's we probably haven't chatted verbally in 15 plus years.
Yeah.
And so it's funny hearing you now. There's a lot of similarities back when we were growing up.
Yeah.
Where I feel like you know the questions to ask. You're direct. You know what you want. You know what you need, et cetera. And you know that for the people around you. I wonder if in that process, was there anything in the back of your mind? Because when you jump into that, and I've been there too, right? As a foster parent myself, where it's you take that one yes, and then you're kind of in that wait mode. And then when child's placed, then you're in go mode and you're just doing the things. But I wonder if at the beginning stages of that journey, when Gracie was originally placed in your home, or really any child, was there an underlying of I'm worried about this because this yes, it is a yes. And it's always about what's the next yes. But because this is such a big yes and it could be life altering, right? Obviously for Gracie, but for you, and your family. Was there anything in the back of your mind that was I'm really worried about these things?
I think it was in the first couple months, and really much, much longer in the first couple months, but the first couple months are a blur. She had so much grief and she was 3 and nonverbal. She had no way to process it. She'd lost a lot. And what comes out of that when you're 3 and you don't know who is safe and you don't know who to trust, I ended up really struggling with blocked care and she wanted no affection. She didn't want to be held. She didn't want to be comforted. She didn't want to be snuggled. She was still on a bottle and she would take her bottle laying in the middle of the living room floor and she did not want to be, that was a whole process just getting her to let me sit next to her while she took that bottle. I couldn't hand her a toy because if I handed her anything, she rejected it. So she'd be just sitting in the middle of the living room floor and I would just walk through and just casually drop a toy near her. It was the only way I could give things to her. And so dealing with that, with just pouring into a child who is rejecting you again and again because of how deeply hurt they are and not knowing how to reach that. And then just dealing with the the overstimulation of just screaming and crying all the time and parenting a child with significant disabilities and medical needs, but also really significant emotional needs. And I had a moment where I thought, if this is forever, I don't know. I don't know if I can be screamed at forever. I don't know. I don't know if I can reach out to pick up a crying child and be pushed away forever. And of course, in my logical brain now, if someone else said that to me, I would say, well, it's not forever. That's not logical. This is a very hurt child who won't always be this hurt. Like they're, problem. I mean, of course you don't know. And I think there was definitely those moments where it was like, what have I done? What have I said yes to? What have I walked into? Because she was deeply struggling.
Yeah.
And I knew how to do, like you said, go mode. I knew the right people to call. I knew how to get the equipment we needed. I knew how to get her into the therapy we needed in school and all that. What I didn't always know how to do, and still don't, is how to address the trauma, meet the emotional needs when there wasn't any language. She had no communication ability, zero at all. She could not say yes, no, stop, more, nothing. And she's got a significant cognitive impairment. She also is 3. So getting her to understand, I'm safe, I'm going to meet your needs. You don't trust that that's true, but it is. And just that stuff can't be solved as easily. To me, the disability stuff, the medical stuff, yes, it's not easy, but it's simple. It's a matter of finding the right solutions, finding the right providers, making the phone calls, ordering the equipment, taking the steps. And there's things to learn how to do those things. The trauma side is so much longer and deeper, and it's so much more interpersonal work. It doesn't require a whole lot of interpersonal work on me to teach her how to walk, to teach her, some sign language and communication. It is a whole, parenting kids with trauma will bring out every single bit of ugliness you have inside yourself. So those were the moments when I kind of sort of stopped and said, what have I done? Is this going to get better? Or is this going to be the next 75 years of my life is doing this?
Yeah, obviously, my wife now. Kate asked me not too long ago, it was a conversation that we were having, and the question that she had asked was like something like along the lines of like, hey, is this ever going to end? And I remember like in that moment kind of suggesting, and I don't know that this is the right answer, right? But I was like, I don't know that it does, right? Like, I think it just changes. And so along those lines, like, I'm curious, like, how have you seen maybe some of those fears that you've had in the past and even current, right? How have you seen that journey with Gracie change? Right? Because you kind of mentioned a little bit of like, at the beginning, it's kind of like, and maybe even like still to some degree, right? That it's like, hey, it's hard to address, this need that she has. She's sitting on the floor and like, I'm just going to go drop a toy, right? It's hard to meet this kind of need. She's screaming back here, right? And I know you've had a couple of kids come through your home. But yeah, how have you seen that journey like change, right? Kind of speak to where you guys are at, not necessarily now, but the journey in general.
I think, it's just those tiny baby steps and those tiny moments of consistently meeting those needs, which, with her, when she was 3, she functioned on the level of an infant. She was not walking, she was not communicating, and she wasn't eating solid food. She was essentially a 6-month-old baby, but in a 3.5-year-old's body and with 3.5 years of grief and sadness and loss and trauma. And so on one hand, her developmental delay almost made it easier in the sense that she needed to be like a baby in a lot of ways. I was spoon feeding her things. I was changing diapers, things like that you may not always do with a 3-year-old. So that trust cycle, that a little baby has of they cry and you meet the need. I was able to do more of that than you can with a lot of 3-year-olds. But also at the same time, she wasn't a baby. She was not the size of a baby. A baby doesn't have 3.5 years of having her trust broken. So it was a lot of just meeting immediate physical needs and telling myself, and having to sometimes just really have to say out loud to myself, even though in this moment, like if I see another spoon hit the wall, but but telling myself this shows her the way I respond in this next moment shows her whether or not I'm trustworthy. The way I respond in this moment shows her whether or not I am going to continue to show up time and time again. And sometimes it's just saying those things out loud to her before she even could understand them. I remember one time she got hurt, and she gets hurt way less than you would think. I mean, you'd think that a kid with a visual impairment, a physical impairment, didn't walk till she was 4. You'd think she'd get hurt more.
Resilient.
She actually does not get hurt. And she got hurt one time. She swung her head forward and hit kind of the bridge of her nose on the corner of a shelf, and cried and cried. And she has a really high pain tolerance. So for her to actually, but she, instead of getting, oh, I'm sad and I want to be held, she was angry and did not want me to hold her. And I don't know if I made the right choice. I mean, maybe a therapist would tell me I did it wrong, but I remember thinking in that moment.
That's for a different podcast.
Another podcast can review this podcast and then tell me if I did it right or wrong. I just remember thinking, like, if I let her, she has self-soothed for her whole life. She spent too much time sitting alone in her hurt. And if I let her be hurt and alone, I'm reinforcing that. And so even though she does not want me to hold her and comfort her, and in general, I honor and respect that, in this moment, I think it is better to not honor her preference, but to show her that I am here. And so I held her and I just told her over and over, I said, this is what mamas do when babies get hurt. This is what mamas do when their babies get hurt. And she was mad. She didn't want to be held. But I needed her to know that I won't let you be hurt and alone anymore. And she's still, to this day, she just hurt herself a couple days ago, and she still does not like to be held. But she knows now that I'm her mom. So now I'm okay with that. I scoop her up, I check her over, ask her where it hurts, and then I just sit next to her. And I'm okay with her not wanting to be held. But when she was little, I just felt like I couldn't let her just sit and hurt alone because she'd spent too much time doing that.
Yeah, for sure. No, I appreciate you sharing that. And I think a lot of it is like we talk often here, and you've probably heard something similar, right? The idea of like what oftentimes like a lot of this trauma and a lot of the hurt happens in context of relationships, right? And so the healing aspects can only happen also in the context of relationships. And I can imagine, like, I've been in similar spots, obviously different like contexts with kiddos where it's like, it feels similar where I'm saying these things out loud for this child so that they know that. And I'm also saying it for myself.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about like, there's been a couple of people even recently that I can even think of one yesterday that I had a conversation with somebody that's about to go through the licensing process, single foster parent, and just going along that journey. What challenges exist there? There's also probably some pros to that, right? And yeah, what is that journey like in terms of as you're thinking of taking a disabled child into your home, right? I'm sure that there are questions of like, and you had some of the, I guess what we would say like the tools and skills, right, from your professional background. But for those who maybe don't, right, like were there things that were going on in your mind of like, am I going to have the support like for my child, like whether it's your family or friends? I'm sure you have a support system, but wonder if you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think, there's definite pros and cons to being a single parent. I like that I make all the decisions. There's never any resentment. There's never any, you didn't handle that the way that I think you should have. But also on the other hand, it's lonely. There's been a lot of moments in my parenting journey, both with Gracie and with kiddos that I parented before, where it's almost like the office moment, where you just like look in the camera and you want to just, whether it's, these really incredible, oh my gosh, they just took their first steps moments, or the poop has hit the fan quite literally. Yeah. Is this really our life? And you want to look across the living room and know that someone else is living your reality with you.
They see it. Yeah.
And I don't have that. And that is hard to not have somebody to share the high highs and the low lows. But I have family, I have friends. My sister gets lots of really random Marco Polos of just, sometimes it's
Marco Polo is still going, everybody.
I don't even know if anybody else uses Marco Polo. I Marco Polos 2 people, only 2. One of them being a friend of ours from high school, who also now works in the adoption space. But that is it, is those 2 people. But I'll pick up the phone and FaceTime. Gracie ate blackberries for the first. She doesn't eat fruit at all. No fruit for her entire life. She ate blackberries the other day, and I am FaceTiming my sister while I'm hiding in the kitchen because if I go in, Gracie will then say, never mind, I don't want these blackberries, I want something else. And so I was, I'm FaceTiming from the kitchen and showing. So, I think just when you choose to be a single parent, you have to also make conscious choices to learn to depend on other people. And that's something that's very, very difficult for me. I'm very much I can do it on my own kind of lady. Like I have my career. I've bought my house. I mow my yard. I raise my kid. I do all the things. But there are sometimes things I just can't. Even today, for me to be here, I had to ask someone to watch my child because there isn't another parent to say, I need you to pick her up from school today. Back when I first got Gracie, I was in a community group, a small group at my church. And there was just a lot of reasons why it just wasn't a good fit for the season of life we were in.
Yeah.
It was just too hard. It was just really hard.
Yeah.
And I found myself sort of having pulled away from community in a lot of ways. And so Gracie and I are in the process of stepping, back into church, stepping back into community. And I've rejoined a new small group. But the way a lot of our small groups do it is, two of the weeks a month is kind of everyone's together and it's Bible study and all that. And then 1 week a month is guys' night and all the guys go out and obviously the moms stay home with the kids. And then one is vice versa. All the women go out and the guys stay home with the kids. That doesn't work if there's not two parents. And so there's a lot of things that at our church have come out of me sort of finally breaking and sort of almost throwing a fit and saying, these things don't work for my family. The systems that are in place don't work for my family.
Yeah.
And our church has been really gracious. And someone is paying for a babysitter one Tuesday a month so that I can go to girls' night. The first time was this past week. And it's the first time I'd ever left Gracie with a babysitter, not with my mom or my sister or a really close friend. So first time I ever just left her with a babysitter and it felt crazy to leave, but it went great and someone is paying for it. Someone said, we're going to prioritize this single mom being able to be in community. And so we're going to just remove that barrier, So I think things like that for single parents, just sort of identifying where's your village going to be? What's your support's going to be? Who are going to be the people you call?
Well, and I think too, right? Like I think there's probably two angles of this. One, there are systems in place, whether it's a church, whether it's the system, like the child welfare system itself, whether it's this program or it's this resource or it's you name it, right? It's this children's ministry program, whatever, that do not fit what you would say is like my family dynamics, right? And you could insert, there's probably hundreds of foster parents that would say something similar about their like family dynamic setup, right? Like I've been in spots where it's like, oh, this experience, and again, you name it, resource program, group that we went to, whatever, right? That's like, this doesn't actually work for my family or my family dynamic. And so it is this kind of push and pull of like, how much do I have to advocate? I'm already doing all of this advocating work for my child and for my family. Do I also have to do it here too? And I'm saying that to say, I'm curious, how much did you balance the like, I've got to advocate for myself to apparently get this for my family, versus I wonder what would you say to like an organization, resource, church, et cetera, to say, hey, these are things that we should be considering and it's not on those families to advocate for it, right? Creating like felt safety within these communities. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm living that right now. That is what I am living. So Gracie and I stopped going to church for about 2 years. We were going on holidays. We went Easter, Christmas, maybe a Sunday or two in the summer. But in general, we weren't going at all because there wasn't a place for her in kids ministry. They never told us no. They never said you can't bring her. But what I found is that she was just being babysat. She was just there, but she wasn't, there wasn't anything to make sure that she actually was accessing the curriculum. The other kids are being taught scripture, and she's playing with toys. The other kids are on the playground and she's just in the classroom because she didn't understand the question. When they said it's time to go outside, she didn't understand, so she just stayed put. Things like that. And so I already was fighting other fights. Like you said, you're advocating in so many other spaces. You can't do it in every space. And the fights were too big in other areas. I was advocating too big. And also just, I was earlier on in our life together as a mom and a daughter, and there were just fights at home of just myself trying to fight through my own sin and humanness in order to be the mom she needs me to be. And I just didn't have the capacity. And so I have been at the church that I'm at since college, since basically a week after that church launched. And so I wasn't ready to say, I'm going to walk away and find another church, because I love our church and I've been there, like I said, for a long time. I have deep relationships. I've seen it grow from this tiny little church plant in this really hot building behind an HEB where we had, it was a whole thing, to now what it is. And so I didn't want to walk away, but I also didn't have the energy to fight. Yeah. So we just kind of stopped. And there's hurt that goes with that, that says, why didn't anybody do anything, But then we went on Easter Sunday this past spring. And it was bad. We got there late. We barely made it in the door. We're both almost in tears. I brought her little Easter basket because she finally understands Easter egg hunts, and our church always does an Easter egg hunt. We get there and they say, well, the sanctuary's full. You got to go up to overflow. Gracie's not good at stairs. And I should have just said no. I should have said, we're sitting on the floor in the back and I don't really care. But I followed the rules and I drug her up the stairs to overflow. Me too, Gracie. I
don't do stairs.
Drug her up the stairs to overflow. She had a giant meltdown up there. So then I just stood up and we went back down. And then I thought, well, maybe we'll just kind of like walk around and tell Easter egg hunt, because we've always done the Easter egg hunt between services. And then I saw the preschool class coming in with their full little baskets, and they decided to do it in class.
Yeah.
And that pushed, I'm sorry, I don't want to cry. That pushed me over the edge, because I was like, not only could we not access service, but now she can't even get Easter eggs because she doesn't have a class. And so even Easter egg hunting is not for her. And so we were on our way to leave. I was angry. I was hurt. I was like, this was my little effort. Like I said, we're going to go to church on Easter and we're going to do it. And it just fell on my face. And I ran into a good friend of mine who was on staff at our church. And she, said, I'm glad you're here. And then I just unloaded. I mean, it was like a temper tantrum. I mean, I just said, and she knew little bits of sort of why. She knew that we had not been at church, and she knew that it just, was really hard for us in this season. But I just said all the things. I said, this is why it doesn't work. This is what's not fair. This is why I'm hurt. And she's one of the best listeners I know. And so she just stood there, and we were literally in the hallway of the church, and Gracie's rolling around on the floor and people are stepping over her. And I'm just like weeping and just literally throwing a fit of all the things that were wrong and all the hurt. And she listened and she said, what needs to be done for you guys to come? And now that was, it was Easter. So 6 months later, we're close to them starting a ministry at our church for kids with disabilities, and it's just a couple of them right now. It's just a tiny little handful. But that conversation then launched that friend of mine reaching out and finding a person to sort of head up this ministry, and they found volunteers to be buddies, and I'm going to help adopt curriculum when they get to that point, and there's a plan in place and it's happening. And so, that's been very encouraging to see. I was so hurt and frustrated for a long time, but when I did finally have the capacity to advocate, things are actually happening.
Yeah, I'm curious, in your opinion, what does it look like? Right, we're talking about church, but organizations in general, to create safe spaces for families like yours, whether it's with kids who have disabilities or foster family, like in general, right? Even prior to Gracie being in your home, I'm curious, we talk a lot, like at Riverside Project, about like, how do we help churches, organizations, homes, even families, right? Create spaces that are safe for kids from hard places. Like, what is that? Well, what is the ideal, quote unquote, does that look like?
I think, especially when we look at kind of that intersection, because we know kids in foster care, kids who've experienced hard things are more likely to have disabilities, and kids with disabilities are more likely to experience trauma. So there's this intersection is huge. And I think, especially when we look at churches, it comes from the belief that all people are created for and have capacity for a relationship with God. And starting from that place, then we can move forward into meeting the practical needs of, is the space physically accessible? Is it emotionally overwhelming to kids who have experienced hard things, kids who have experienced trauma? I think staff training is important, but I also think just staff and volunteers catching the vision for why are we doing this? Why does it matter? I used to serve in our kids ministry before Gracie and I stopped going, and I was always a real stickler about the safety procedures, the stickers and the check-in and check-out. And I had a family really upset with me because I wouldn't let their kid keep his check-in sticker.
Yeah.
And they went and tattled to the pastor on me, and he told them exactly why. But it's things like that I think allows parents to take a deep breath when they know there are procedures and policies in place. And I mean, even with the family that was upset with me, I told them, I said, at that time, Gracie wasn't adopted. And I said, my child is one of the children. That's one of the reasons we have this policy in place. My daughter does not share my last name at that time. There are, and I think making sure that everybody involved knows why we do the things that we do. Why do we use trauma-informed care practices? Why is it important? And not even necessarily, we need to know it's this kid and it's this family and it's this situation, but knowing that we don't know.
Yeah, I think that's the big thing, right? Exactly like what you said. It's knowing that we don't know.
Yeah.
And acknowledging that. And I think in the church context, it's how do we disciple our people to really understand kids from hard places, trauma, etc. Right? I think just so that there's no harm in creating the systems in place because it is accessible. And then once you know better, right? Is like kind of that concept. But I have one question I wanted to ask you was talk to me a little bit about, and I've probably already used some poor language or whatever, but talk to me about like kids with disabilities. Mm-hmm. What is the proper language there? Obviously, like, this like professionally, but even as a parent, like maybe you've adjusted some things. What are things that if somebody was listening to this podcast that would say, I thought I was saying it, and I know there's a lot of gray and maybe nuance and people decide different things, but from your perspective and your experience, what's the appropriate way to talk about kids like Gracie?
For me and for my family, I refer to Gracie as disabled. Because a lot of people use the term special needs. I don't hear it much anymore, but I've heard handy capable. All of these are just euphemisms, and the purpose they serve is to make us more comfortable. Mm-hmm. They don't communicate anything with any more clarity. If anything, they muddy the waters. People with disabilities don't have special needs, they have human needs. They need the same thing we all need. They need food, water, comfort, housing, belonging, acceptance, independence, all of these things. The means by which they might access those things they might need accommodations, they might need different supports, they might need different avenues, but at the end of the day, they want and need the same things. I think there's a lot of stigma, and our society especially is very output based. What do you create? What are you capable of? What do you produce? And I think that puts a lot of and some of this is just really historical. Seeing disability as a bad thing. Seeing it as a bad thing to be disabled. It means that something is missing, something is broken, something is wrong. We were leaving the pediatrician yesterday, and a little boy looked at Gracie and said, "What's wrong with her?" And I said, "Nothing, she just had a checkup." That's not what he was asking. That's not at all what he was asking. He was asking either, why isn't she talking? Why does she have a white cane? What is, and that's a question that I've gotten plenty of times is what is wrong with her? And if it's adults, I am a little maybe less kind depending on the context. If it's a child, I say nothing is wrong with her. She's exactly as she was meant to be. I think what you're trying to say is, does she have a disability? I think that's what maybe you're trying to ask. And then I kind of give them the language. Ultimately, for individuals who are able to self-identify and self-advocate, there's a broad spectrum of how people want to identify, especially when we talk about adults who have disabilities. What's led me to decide how to refer to Gracie, since she's not able to understand and advocate for herself yet, is kind of no community has consensus or is a monolith or anything, but the larger voices that I hear and listen to and read of disabled people, especially, for example, Gracie is deafblind. So she has a combined hearing and vision loss. And every deafblind adult I've ever met, read a book by, followed on social media, refers to themselves as deafblind. And so that's how I refer to Gracie. It's a part of who she is. It can't be separated out. Being disabled it can't can't be separated out from who she is. I also refer to her as autistic. A lot of people prefer to say people with autism.
Yeah.
I think people, I think parents can identify how they want for their children, but I think we also have to be aware of not over euphemizing and cutesifying things to where we're not being clear and to where we make our children believe that there's a reason we don't call things what they are. I want Gracie to always grow up knowing that being deafblind, being autistic, being disabled, these are all core, being adopted, these are all core parts of her identity. They don't cover or encompass all of who she is, but there are parts of who she is that she doesn't ever need to feel embarrassed by or ashamed of or feel she needs to hide. And it also ties into self-advocacy. If we want our kids to learn to advocate for their own needs, why do you need these sensory supports? Well, I need these sensory supports because I'm autistic and my brain processes sensory information differently.
Right.
Why do you need your white cane? Why do you need caption? They need to be able to advocate for these things. And I think we as adults have to get over our own discomfort. Even as you and I sat down, you were a little uncomfortable with referring to Gracie as disabled. I was very comfortable when I became her mom with saying kids with disabilities. I was a little less comfortable saying my child is disabled. And I think it just comes from that feeling of we kind of bristle at labels. We don't want to label people. We don't want to, but it's a part of who she is. It's a core part of her identity. It's not all of who she is. She's 10 million other things, but it informs every part of her life. And it would do her a disservice to pretend that it's just a small little side footnote when it's not. It's going to be a part of her forever, and it's a part of us as a family. Everything we do as a family revolves around making sure that she has access, making sure her needs are met, making sure that she's not excluded from things, and all of that stems from. And for her, she's multiply disabled and medically complex. So for her, it literally is every part of her brain and body are impacted by all of her, various disabilities. And so maybe it's a little more different for us just because she does have so many different things going on. But that's the language I choose for my family. And I think for parents, if you're walking into choosing to parent a child with a disability, there needs to be some interpersonal work that goes on as far as, what are my biases and my preconceived notions that I may not be aware of? Who are the voices that I'm listening to? Am I listening to predominantly the voices of other parents of disabled children, or am I listening to the voices of predominantly disabled adults?
Yeah. And I think that concept even goes beyond kids with disabilities, right? It goes we would talk about even just foster care in general, right? I love that you said that. It even speaks to me. Am I listening to my kids are 19, 19, 20, and 20, right? Am I listening to the voices of youth who are that age, or just the voices of parents who are parenting kids? It's so good. I wonder real quickly if you could kind of talk through, you use language that I think is very trauma-wise, trauma-informed. You call it what you want, where you kind of recognize my child has a need, I'm going to be there to meet it, right? You said something earlier that even made me think man, I wish so many parents understood this, right? Where it's this journey of self-discovery, right? Of part of the reasons why I can't meet the needs of my child is because there's needs that I have that haven't been met. I'm curious, talk to me a little bit about where some of that language, I assume, comes from your professional background. So whether it's that or even additional things that have kind of helped inform the way that you are meeting needs for Gracie and for children who have been in your home or kids that you have served professionally. Where's that coming from? Are there things or resources or books that you've kind of tapped into that have been really helpful for your journey as a parent?
I wish more of it came from professionally, but unfortunately teachers get very, very, very little. Sure. We do one little virtual online training at the beginning of every year that's called Trauma-Informed Care, and it's just the bare bones basics. Some of it came from just initial foster parent training. Certainly there's not enough in that. I don't think anybody leaves their initial foster parent training and just feels ready to go and equipped. Yeah. But I think, I listen to a ton of audiobooks. And so some of that is listening to books about trauma. I should have pulled up my Audible and I could scroll through some titles. Some of it is just reading. It's funny, we talked about the experiences of adults who have been through the things that our kids have been through. Some of it comes from that, of seeing how practices when our kids are little actually play out in good ways or in bad ways in adults. You know, of course, in foster parent spaces, especially Christian foster parent spaces, Jamie Finn's book, you know, whatever, Foster the Family or whatever it's called, is great. Body Keeps the Score, of course, is I think required reading should be for foster parents.
It's like the textbook, right?
Right. I actually was just thinking, I was listening to a podcast on my way here about trauma, and it reminded me that it's been a really long time since I've read Body Keeps the Score, but it's in my Audible, and I was like, maybe I should do a little reread of that. I was just listening to a podcast on the way here, an interview with Gabor Mate, and I haven't read his book. He's got a couple of books, but that's on my list. I think we just can never consume enough, you know, because I think trauma is one of those things that, and just meeting kids' emotional needs at all.
Yeah.
We're broken people trying to help broken people. And, you know, I think it's so easy, at least for me, to sort of slip out of some best practices and you know, nobody can be on their A game all the time. So I try to make sure that I'm consuming content, even if it's just in brief little snippets on social media, or audiobooks or podcasts or whatever that are going to keep on my mind that the decisions I make in hard moments have profound impact on my child, because those are the moments when it's the hardest. Those are the moments when, you know, it's 4:00 in the morning and you've barely slept and she won't go to sleep and you're frustrated. But those are also the moments that inform her about who I am and who she is. And, you know, if I'm to be trusted, if I'm going to be consistent in my responses to her hard moments. So I try to just kind of keep learning.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. And yeah, if you want to send us some of those, we can list them in the show notes of things and resources that have obviously been helpful to you as a parent. Couple more questions kind of before we wrap up. I'm curious of what's one of the biggest things that you're learning about yourself right now as a parent?
Man.
Not maybe past tense, but like currently.
Yeah.
Like what's because obviously the journey has probably shifted, you know, over the last couple of years, but.
The irony of parenting a child who struggles with self-regulation is realizing how much I struggle with self-regulation and, you know, just recognizing when I need to make sure my needs are met. And thankfully in my household, because Gracie has a hearing impairment, we mostly sign and she doesn't speak verbally. So at home, that means I've got noise canceling headphones in a lot, just to take the edge of the noise off. And for me, it's been a lot of just identifying those strategies and identifying in myself, you know, what are the things that I need to be. I'm not a super self-aware person. And so, you know, just that's something that being a parent, I think just a parent of any kid at any time.
The irony of you saying that is being self-aware, but yes.
That's my journey. That's my journey is learning to be self-aware and to recognize patterns in myself and to recognize, you know, what are the patterns that are feeding me and what are the patterns that are hurting me, and making sure that I'm modeling things for my child. You know, am I modeling, you know, healthy emotional regulation? Am I modeling, healthy behaviors, even just in regards to the food we eat, the activities we do? How much TV am I watching? How much podcast am I listening to versus how much are we going outside? Little things like that I'm just sort of learning to, as she gets older and older, learning to reflect a lot on myself and on who do I want her to grow up to be, and who am I growing up to be, and how can I grow both of us into the people that I want to see us become.
Somebody listening to this podcast that's like kind of hearing your story, that's maybe either considering like becoming a foster parent, that's maybe a single foster parent that's like wanting to step in, or considering taking that like maybe more complex placement of like, how do I even do that? What do you hope that like somebody would walk away with, kind of knowing about their own journey?
I think my hope would be to just demystify it a little bit, to just take some of the almost shock factor of just hearing a list of diagnoses or conditions, or reading it on a page, or reading it on an email. And, you know, I would hope that the parent that's on the other side hearing this or thinking about this might I think about the little checklist that I had to do at some point where it's which conditions are you, I don't remember if it's which are you open to or which are you not open to. But looking at that and even if it's just checking a couple more boxes, even if it's just being open to a little bit more than you thought that you were open to, because the reality is, especially for kids with complex needs, they spend more time in care before finding permanency. They experience more placement changes. And depending on the severity of the needs, especially medical needs, they can often are more likely to end up institutionalized or hospitalized if we don't have enough foster parents to take them. And so I think, it's almost like a fake it till you make it. The reality is I don't think any of us are prepared to parent any of our children, no matter how those children come to us. But if parents can just sort of take one more step of taking the sticker shock off a little bit and just thinking, okay, what could the real day-to-day look like? I was just talking with our mutual friend from high school, Lindsay Bellis, who works for an adoption agency, and we were talking through some of these things about just the types of questions, and she works in private adoptions, but the types of questions for parents to consider when they get a referral of a child, and some things about just not just, okay, they have this diagnosis, they have this condition, they have this, but what could the day-to-day look like? What could it look like for us to parent a child who's not verbal? What could it look like for us to parent a child who uses a mobility device? What could it look like? And kind of taking a step past just that, the words make me uncomfortable. I've never known a child with this disorder, this condition, this, diagnosis, but taking a little step back, doing the research, talking to either other parents who parent children that may share some of those conditions, or talking to professionals, or talking to therapists, or whoever it may be, to get a little bit better day-to-day look of what could it look like. And then just recognizing that some of these things aren't as scary as they sound, and some of that just comes from time and context. And, I think if parents are considering parenting children with more complex needs, jumping in and volunteering, offering to babysit, respite, things like that, just to get, for me, when I was in college, I nannied for a family, and they've now adopted a whole bunch more kids, siblings and things, but at the time they'd adopted 3 out of their 4 kids from foster care. And one had a terminal medical condition, one had autism. And so, and then their biological child also had a medical condition. And I didn't have any experience with any of that, but having that experience just as a nanny and doing the therapy and doing the, dealing a little bit with medical equipment and things like that just made it a little bit less scary. And then obviously my profession, and I think the more you're around kids with more complex needs, the more comfortable you get. And so I could imagine it would feel really scary to just say, yes, we'll parent this kid with this disability, and we've never even met a person with this disability before. I think just, finding ways to connect and to have some contact, whether it's with kids directly or with their families, and just getting a little more comfortable, and then just being brave and being willing to say yes, because behind all these long lists they're just kids. They're kids first. That's kind of the driving force in my life, is that above all these other things that Gracie is, she's 7. She's a 7-year-old little girl, and she deserves a childhood,
Yeah, no, that's so good. Thanks for sharing that. Is there anything else that you want to talk about, like with your journey, that maybe we didn't cover?
I did, when I was just looking at this earlier and thinking about systems, we talked about churches, we talked about kind of in the, on that side of it. I think schools, and that's my context. When I first became a special education teacher, there's practices that were sort of kind of the common best practices that then once I became more trauma informed, and I don't remember if that was becoming a foster parent or before. We have a lot of kids who've experienced hard things in the school I work in also, but recognizing that some of these practices that are really common when working with kids with disabilities are very counterintuitive and often harmful for kids who've experienced trauma. The 2 big things that come to mind, one is compliance. A lot of times, especially with kids with autism, you'll hear providers, and some of that comes from, some specific therapy modalities that I don't necessarily agree with, but there's a lot of importance put on getting kids to comply, because the idea is that if we can get them to comply, then we can sort of teach them what we need to teach them, and we can sort of, for lack of a better word, control them and get them to do, be compliant and well-behaved in these settings. But for kids who have experienced trauma, who are likely at a lot higher risk of, exploitation and abuse and neglect, teaching them to just go along with what adults say without the presence of a safe, nurturing relationship is really dangerous. And I've shifted big time away from anything that's compliance based, in my job.
Yeah.
And then another big thing that we talk about in my school, where we have a lot of kids with food insecurity, is using food as a reinforcement. That's really, really, really common. You go in any special education classroom, there's probably a kid working for M&Ms or Goldfish or Skittles. But for kids who've experienced food insecurity, food is a big trauma trigger for my daughter. And so food is for feeding our bodies, and that is it. It is not for anything else. It is for feeding our bodies, and it is for tasting good, and that's it. And so for kids who have experienced food insecurity, and I've read some interesting things that even mothers who have experienced food insecurity while the child's in utero, even if the child never experiences food insecurity after birth, their body and brain still remember.
Yeah, totally.
And so making sure that food is not being used as a reinforcer, or absolutely not being, withheld as a consequence. But these are things that are just so commonly done. And if you don't have the trauma-informed lens, and if you don't really think about, why am I doing this? Why, am I doing it because this is just what everybody else does, and this is what I've been told? And so I think schools, and there's, of course, a million other things I could talk about with schools, but I think when I think about trauma-informed care with kids with disabilities in the school setting, those are the two big things that are kind of non-negotiables for me as far as, just shifting our practice in that reference.
Yeah, that's great. Like, real quick on that, compliant, I mean, that's even like outside of the disabilities world, like that's like a big thing, right? For somebody that's like, oh, well, like we're focused on these outcomes, and if they don't comply, then we don't get these outcomes. I'm curious if you have like quick thoughts on that, and if you've seen the opposite of that, right?
I think I've definitely seen it. I see it even in, I don't know, you've met my parents, and my parents are fantastic. I love my parents, but that's kind of the parenting I was raised in. Is that was a term I heard in my house was, obey all the way, the right way, and the happy way, something like that. That was like their mantra.
Yeah.
And I totally get why they did it and why they felt like that was the best. But I think if we want to raise kids who are critical thinkers, who are self-protective, who are self-advocates, because we're not going to be next to them, for the rest of their lives. My child's probably going to live with me forever, but that's not most parents' reality. We're going to send them off. Your kids are big. You're sending them out into the world, and you want them to stand up for themselves. You want them to not be compliant when things are not right. And maybe we have to make some concessions, like you said, on the output, on the outcomes, on, we need people to be compliant, to do the things so that we have the right outcome. And, I think if we're focused on relationships and connection over the compliance, I think we'll still have those outcomes. But I think even if we don't, I think it's worth the trade-off. Mm-hmm. I think I'd rather have a kid who knows she can say no, even if that means sometimes she tells me no. I'd rather deal with that now as a 7-year-old, her, telling me no, versus someday when she's 25 feeling like she can't tell someone no,
Yeah, no, that's really good. Yeah, thanks for sharing all that. So as we kind of wrap up here, kind of have like last 5 questions for the last 5 minutes for you. First question is this. What's your favorite book to read with your daughter?
I have my favorite I like to read to her, and then she has her favorites that she likes to be read to. My favorite is a book called A Day with No Words, and it is from the perspective of a little boy who uses a communication device, which Gracie does as well. And it's the story of him and his mom going to a park, and he loves to spin around barefoot in the wet grass, and some moms nearby are kind of pointing and snickering and sneering, and his mom goes and tells him off, and then kind of gets him and is like, rock on, dude, like spin in your grass and then let's go eat French fries. And so of course, as a mom of a nonverbal kid, I just love that book. Gracie thinks it's a little too long and she gets annoyed with me partway through. I read it to her still, even though she doesn't seem to care too much. Yeah. Her favorite books are this whole long series of, we have about 10 of them, of just these felt lift the flap books, and every page is
that.
Where's the chick, and you flip it and there's the chick, there it is, and it's the same thing every single book. just different theme for everyone, and she could read the same one for 20 minutes. So, and the last page is always a mirror, and where are you? And then she flips the last one, and then she grabs the book, and she looks at herself in the mirror, and then she gives it back, and she says again, and we flip back, and we read it again.
Yeah, that's hilarious. I love that. Obviously, and you kind of mentioned it a little bit on the podcast already, but like there's probably many like challenging moments, some isolating moments, things like that. But I wonder if is there something that Gracie does that's like it never fails to make you laugh?
I always say she's the funniest kid I've ever met. I mean, you've never met a kid that could make you laugh without saying a single word. I mean, she is a jokester. She started, she'll like imitate things, which is a fantastic skill that I didn't know she'd ever have because of her visual impairment. But sometimes she'll ask me for something that she knows, it's just really, really random. We'll be at the grocery store and she'll sign iPad. Like, we're not have iPad in the grocery store. We've never done that before. But she knows I'm going to say no. And she asks because she wants me to say no. And I'll sign no, but then I'll also shake my head. And then she'll go and shake it back. And then sometimes she'll kind of look at me for a while. And then she'll like do something else. She'll do a little hop. And she wants me to do it back. And it can just... And it's just in the most random moments, and it can just snap us out of whatever is going on and into this just really funny little moment of connection.
Yeah. No, I love that. Okay, last question. I'm going off script a little bit, so I do apologize. But what's just hearing your story, I wonder if you can speak briefly to what do you hope for you and Gracie and your family, like in the next couple of years? Like if you look ahead, and you're just like, man, I really hope that it feels like this, or it looks like this, or I don't know, or that she's like that, whatever. Yeah.
I think, when I think, and I don't know if I could really say in the next couple years, but I could say when I picture our life when she's an adult, I think there's a really strong possibility she's going to live with me for the rest of her life. And I'm, when I chose to be her mom, I knew that was likely going to be our reality. And so I'm great with that. I have no qualms about that. I think my hope is that when she is an adult, she has something she does, somewhere she goes that makes her feel like she has purpose. So I don't know if that's going to be some form of supported employment. I don't know if it's going to be a day hab center with people she loves. I don't know if it's going to be volunteering. I don't know what it's going to be, but I want her to have purpose. I want her to feel when she's an adult, I want her to feel like an adult, even if I'm still caring for her and providing most of her care, I want her to feel like even if she lives with me forever, I want there to be a shift at some point where it doesn't feel like I live with my mom, but it feels like my mom and I live together. And where she has whatever amount of autonomy and agency and decision making she is capable of at whatever point. I want her to have all of that. And I want her to feel like she brings something to the world or to our community or whatever, even if that is just her presence of existing in a space with people who love her. And so I don't get caught in the nitty gritty of, I think she's going to be able to do this or this or this, but it's more of, how do I want her to feel? How do I want her to feel when she's 35? I don't want her to feel like a child. I don't want her to feel like my mom does everything for me and takes care of me, and I just sort of go where I'm supposed to go. I want her to feel grown in all the ways that she's able to. So I kind of hope we just get to be like a dynamic duo forever. I picture us, a couple of little old ladies in a nursing home someday, and I'm 85 and she's 60, and just in our little rocking chairs together.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thanks for taking time to just share your story. I know it's very personal, both to you and Gracie, and so thanks for sharing that with me, sharing that with us. Very powerful story. And thanks for just being somebody who advocates so well for kids and families in our state and in your city, in our city, and just being somebody that has hope and empathy for that. So thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
To those listening, we hope these conversations have inspired you to find your place along the river. And we welcome you to join us in bringing hope and renewal to the city of Houston. If you'd like more information on how to get involved, please visit riversideproject.org and submit a contact form. We'll see you next time.